What's next for IT? In today's economy, technology touches every aspect of the day-to-day operations of business. There has never been more pressure on IT to deliver for our organizations. So what can we expect over the next decade? We need to think differently about how we approach our work to continue to thrive into the future. This requires all of us to be intentional in how we look at our role going forward. Smart IT is an approach to getting the important things done by transforming the way we think, work, and lead. And now, let's disrupt the status quo, simplify the complex, and reduce risk the smart IT way. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Smart IT Podcast. Today, I would like to welcome Chris Norris to the show. Chris has seen a lot over the years in both technology and IT. He has been working in IT for far longer than he would like to admit, but along the way has built a large number of relationships with customers, partners, and vendors that have helped him build a reputation as a thought leader among his peers. Chris spends a lot of his time analyzing the trends in an IT industry in order to provide sound advice and draft solutions for his customers that not only work now, but are viable well into the future. This includes cloud technologies, application development trends, and data management. He has a solid basis of working knowledge about how internal IT departments function, plus a practical approach to IT product design. Chris has a solid basis of working knowledge about how internal IT departments function, plus a very practical approach to IT product design. Chris currently has a new role at a national technologist service provider, and we'll ask him in a few minutes to help kind of expand on what that role looks like. Chris, welcome to the show.
Hey, William. Thanks for having me. Been a long time, buddy.
Yeah, I know, man. I think we met over 10 years ago, and it's been a while since we had a chance to catch up.
Yeah, it's been a while.
So I think we worked together for a little bit, and I know the company you worked at had been through a couple of different variations and maturations. So what are you up to these days?
Yeah, no, we work together at a kind of a regional solutions provider, and since then that company's been acquired a couple of times. And my joke is that I've worked for 4 different companies without ever changing jobs. And so I'm currently the chief technologist for Cloud and Datacenter for our North American region. And it's been a fun ride. I've gotten to do a lot of different things during my career. You mentioned a few of them. And now one of the things that I'm really focused on is what our strategic focus looks like in terms of cloud and data center trends, as well as how that branches out into data management and edge technologies.
Fantastic. So when I was putting together the concept of smart IT, I wanted to get into a lot of the human and soft skills as people talk about sometimes. A lot of times tech geeks in IT, which is a good thing. We can go around, get buried in the basement, the back of the data center. We're doing a lot of things but behind scenes. But sometimes some of the IT professionals have trouble interacting with the business, telling them, hey, this is a problem, or here's an opportunity, or just coordinating different teams across the organization. But we don't want to lose the roots of IT, which is, hands on keyboard, down and dirty, coding, architecting. So we got to have digital fluency here. So it's great that to have you on here because we want to talk about data center and cloud. So I know a lot of people out there think of cloud like, hey, it now makes everything in IT easy, right? So it's very, very simple now. Push a couple buttons, credit card with Amazon, and next you know, boom, IT got everything working. So let's kind of start there a little bit because we talk about the next generation of IT. What's that going to look like? Some people may think, hey, you only need core technology skills like networking and storage, how load balances work. Those things are very, very critical even today in the age of cloud. So let's start there and talk about IT professionals looking at it. When they hear, I'm getting into this field and it's cloud, everything's simple, right, Chris?
Yeah, it's quite simple. It's interesting, right? Because there are things that the cloud has greatly simplified. And the other thing that cloud has done is it's pushed a lot of that simplification down into the traditional data center. And I'll give you a couple of easy examples of that. If you go to one of the major cloud providers, like you said, you swipe a credit card, click a button, boom, a server comes online. And it can be that simple. Now, what that doesn't do is it doesn't give you any of the ancillary services that you mentioned. It doesn't give you load balancers. It doesn't give you security. It doesn't give you true end-to-end networking or any of those things. It gives you an operating system running on a piece of hardware, right? So while it does simplify some of those things, it also makes things much more complicated because you now have to manage the same sets of services that you always managed in your data center in another location as well, and that can get touchy, especially when you're doing it with multiple sets of tools. So that's just kind of my initial thoughts on it. But
yeah, I think it's kind of good for the kind of the new people who are looking at technology. They want to get into this field, and then sometimes they may jump in and find out, oh my God, network. What's a network subnet? Oh, Father, we don't write data back to disk anymore, right? Where does it lives in the cloud somewhere. And sometimes even like in security, there's a abstraction of what you're protecting from where it actually lives. And I think sometimes it's good for newbies to hear about it. And even some of the old veterans like, hey, old days of mainframes, we looked at the big iron there and we had networks going across. So let's just get a little view here. So what if I spin up that cloud instance, got my new server, and then somebody in marketing spins up one, and somebody in development spins up one, and you're on Amazon, you're on Microsoft.
Well, now you're moving into a whole different conversation, right? Because now you're talking about, what has been generally referred to as shadow IT, where people go out and I've seen this in customers where we go in and start talking around and we find out that they have not one Amazon or Microsoft account, but dozens of them, and there's different bills all over the place, to the point that I've actually sat down with billing departments or expense departments and accounting departments inside customers and had them go through their expense reports to figure out who's expensing cloud services. And that's how we found some of the different accounts that we can then help them bring together and start looking at, ways that you can collapse all of these different accounts into one organizational system or something along those lines to really start driving some efficiencies in it, right? Because ultimately that's what cloud is about, is driving efficiencies into IT and getting out of kind of the stagnant way and the stagnant methodologies that we've been using for so long.
Yeah, that's an interesting thing. So that leads almost to when you talk about shadow IT and kind of getting back to accounting and find out how many accounts are set up and who's billing what. Now we're starting to get into this question of cost, right? So for early on days it was cloud is cheaper. So that whole myth's been busted, like not necessarily cheaper, right? But I like what you said about the capability, scale, simplicity, these other features of cloud. But for the people in the background, like the enterprise architecture, when he goes to draw the diagram of business service A, and he's drawing this and realize it's more than one cloud. And oh, by the way, some groups still got a partial data center on a colo somewhere with a critical systems that's now being called by an API. So just talk about that enterprise architecture view of all this stuff, on-prem, colo, suppliers, multiple data center, and just all that complexity.
And you nailed it, right? That's really where today's complexity comes in. If you think about what organizations are looking for, most IT organizations are looking for the ability to be able to say, I have a new application or a new workload that I need to roll out to support my business. If I'm an application person, I don't care where it's hosted. I don't care who's managing it. I generally don't care what it sits on. I want to roll out the application, have it work, have good performance, and it should take care of itself, right? We all know that's kind of a misnomer, and it never happens. However, when you start talking about what I would refer to as the multi-cloud landscape, now you start talking about being able to do a large portion of that type of thing, where when someone brings you an application or a workload, you can look at it and say, here are the different metrics that I'm going to associate with this workload, and if it meets these requirements, I'm going to put it in this public cloud. If it meets these requirements, I'm going to put it in my private cloud or on my on-premises data center. Or if it meets these requirements, I'm going to put it in a SaaS provider or all of those different things. And it gives you as an IT department the ability to really go through, measure the application, and determine where is the most appropriate place for it to live, and then architect it, appropriately.
I love that because that gets more back into architecture again. And for some people who are used to just standing up a SAN, right? Hey, I've spent years and years putting the book SANs together, backing it up, replicating across 2 data centers, or just doing
Yep.
networking. How do I do a VPN connection to multiple places? But that it starts to almost get like a systems thinking mindset so let's talk about systems thinking when we talk about all these different pieces and parts and kind of expand a little bit more. When you're talking about, okay, here's the workload that works best in A or B or C, and that's where it lives. That's how much it costs. This is how we monitor it and maintain it. Let's talk a little bit about that system thinking approach to just everybody in IT, know your role and what you're participating in at a higher level.
Yeah, and to your point, when you start taking that systems thinking approach, a lot of organizations have to shift how they're organized, right? I mean, 5-10 years ago, you'd have a server team and a network team and a storage team, and it worked fine because everything was inside of the data centers, and each team had their own set of tools. It's much more difficult to do that in a multi-cloud environment, because if I have things that are sitting in, even 2 of the cloud providers and on-prem, that could potentially be as many as 3 or 4 different distinct sets of tools that each team now has to understand and know. Plus, there's a lot more intersection points between those teams when you start trying to tie an application on-prem with what's going on in this cloud and what's going on with it. For example, if you think about, you mentioned earlier, disaster recovery and data protection. If you think about the idea of backing up things that are sitting on premises and you want to store that data on-prem, but to protect yourself from more modern threats like cyber attacks and things like that, maybe you do an additional copy or multiple copies out into one of the clouds. Now you have to worry about how that data is stored on-prem, how that data is stored in the cloud, how it's replicated, how it moves. There's all of those complexities, and that becomes very difficult for those teams to manage if they're used to having their own little small silo and they haven't developed a mature communication style between the teams.
Yeah, that brought some fascinating conversation. I even remember the whole thing of not only backup but performance, where it's like, hey, we got something on our data center, but it has to work at a certain performance characteristics. So it might need to be close to a Microsoft data center. And what was that old term? Was that Express Route or something? Where it's so now all of a sudden it started to look like almost the old traditional data centers. All of a sudden, like now we're about proximity, and my cloud providers have to have extra data centers to where your stuff is. So it's almost like, wow, we're still got this level of complexity that's not being taken away just because we say the word cloud.
Well, and you're also starting to see some of the major storage or major IT manufacturing companies, starting to take and redevelop their products to fit and sit in the cloud itself. So if you've got a storage array on-prem, you can have the exact same storage array sitting virtually in the cloud. So now that replication set that you used to use on-prem, you're now using it in both places, and it's in the cloud as well. So, that becomes actually, it simplifies things a bit. So,
it also gets into an interesting question about back to what you talk about data protection. So in the old days, you have your mail on-prem, got your Exchange server, and then we would back up the storage groups and the mailboxes, local backup storage. Well, now people say, let's go to Microsoft. They're going to take care of all the mail for us. And then some guy said, hey, are we going to back those mailboxes out? They said, no, we don't have to. Microsoft got that. Said, Microsoft got that. It's like, ooh, interesting. Now, Microsoft obviously have a lot of lawyers and a lot of language in there, but it's a shared model here. So I think early on days, people didn't realize you might still need to back up mailboxes for other reasons. So if something happened to the Exchange mailbox in the cloud, Microsoft might not be on the hook necessarily. You still need to take in consideration, how do I protect the mailboxes? How do I protect the shares? So even though it's sitting somewhere else, you're still responsible for your organization. So just talk about this, like you really can't shift responsibility off to somebody else and just wash your hands of it.
No, I mean, ultimately, the organization's responsible for their own data, their own applications, even regardless of where you're hosting it or who you're using, right? I mean, if you go to one of the major cloud providers and you stand up a bunch of infrastructure, right? You create yourself an infrastructure as a service that you can now access on demand. You load your applications into it. You get everything set up. You're still responsible for the integrity, the protection, and the security of that data. And so all of those things and all of those services that you had to use in the data center are still there in the cloud. Now, you may have different versions of them, and you may be able to use cloud-provided services and things along those lines. And most of the cloud providers have extremely good technology for all of those things. So without getting into individual namings of components, you can absolutely do exactly what you just talked about. Put your mail or your databases or what have you up into the cloud, protect them, everything like that. But what you can't do is drop it up there and not set up the protection and not build out the services that are required to perform those features and expect that protection is there.
So the fundamentals of technology and IT from decades ago are still in play today. I think it's a good message for everybody.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, it's a dramatic shift, but those base fundamental things that you have to do are still there, whether they're done the same way or not, right? I mean, one of the things that we look at a lot today is automation. We talk about how do we pull human error out of our IT systems, right? I mean, back in the day, somebody would go into the data center and they would sit there and they would do things hand by hand on each individual server. We don't want to do that anymore, right? I mean, it's number one, it's inefficient. Number two, if I build some code that allows me to go and perform repeatable tasks, that task is either going to work correctly or it's going to fail, and I'm going to get an error that tells me why, and I can fix that. If I'm going in and I'm doing 50 mouse clicks and typing in a bunch of keystrokes and things like that, I can mistype, I can misclick, and little things change. And when you start getting into application distribution, that's what you would refer to as drift, right? Application drift. By being able to automate the provisioning and the rollout and the management of those applications, we can manage that drift, keep everything much more standardized, which means that we don't run into the same types of issues. When an application breaks, we can start looking at the application or components of it that have failed, as opposed to going, well, did Chris just log into the server and change a bunch of stuff, right? So, that I think is where the maturity in IT organizations is really starting to come into play.
So we're talking about application development. We've been talking about apps. So this huge big wave is APIs. So, I mean, we have an application now that could be performing poorly, not because of underlying storage or necessarily compute. It could just be latency because you're waiting on maybe 2 or 3 APIs that might be a little slow. So you start to think about, mapping all that dependencies for what this business application does. I think a lot of times, the app person may say, this is the diagram of my application. And then another team say, this is how I store the data, where I store it across multiple clouds. But someone still is responsible from the business standpoint to say, here's my SLA, here are minimum latency requirements. So this transaction on the screen for my e-commerce site, they got to be fast and quick. And if there's a problem, I need to know where that is. So back to that whole complexity issue. And if I got an app that requires 40, 50 API calls, let's talk a little bit about that. I've always had that when you go to like a major website for news, and at the bottom you can see there's a delay. And you see all these places going to pull information from. Let's just kind of talk about that wow factor and how complex that is.
It goes back to the changes that have to happen within an organization. When you talk about the complexity of applications and API calls and all of the different things that are going into that, right? And you start talking about, for example, you take a microservices developed app, right? Like e-commerce website, perfect example, right? When I go to an e-commerce website, I log in. The first thing that happens is it's going to go and pull a bunch of information about me, populate the page with the information about me. What have I bought before? What have I browsed before? What are the things that other people like me have bought based on things that are browsed? All of those become different modules within an application now. It's not one huge application. And each of those modules is now making calls into all of the other modules. This means that you've got multiple different teams that are working on the application. You've got multiple different teams that are supporting the underlying infrastructure, right? We've started seeing a shift from individual DevOps team to what's being referred to as platform ops, where you may have a central architecture team that develops the underlying architecture for how an organization is going to build their clouds and how they're going to build that underlying architecture. And then some of those ops people get embedded into the individual development teams to become the operations liaison with that team, right? So that's how the DevOps teams actually operate. What this does is it dramatically eases those communication barriers that I was talking about earlier with regards to the siloed organization. If I have an architecture team that has all of the different components within it. Those people are responsible for laying all of these different bits out, making sure that we've got good images, making sure that things are automated and that our scripts are tested, updated, everything along those lines. Now I embed my ops people in, and they take care of whether it's automation of container deployments or working with the development teams on integrating their CI/CD pipeline into how our automation works and the infrastructure underlying it. That eases that because now we've got lines of communication with the application teams, the operations people that are on the ground working with them, and the back-end architecture teams, as opposed to what we had 5 or 6 years ago, where you would see a cloud team and they were off by themselves and they were developing things, and everybody else in the organization is still just doing exactly what they used to do. And then one day the cloud guy shows up and goes, I'm done. We now have cloud, and nobody knows how to do it, right? By embedding all of these people, you really clean this up, and it helps tremendously to have that type of communication. The other component that's extremely important in that, though, is moving up into executive sponsorship and having leadership within the organization that really works with and understands how these teams are functioning, so that those leaders can understand how they're integrating with the business. What are the things that they're doing? What are the things that need to change in order to really help push things forward? So I'm going to stop. I said a lot, so I kind of babbled there for a minute, but turn it back to see what your thoughts are on that.
Very good insights there. I guess we should start with the old reliable S word, right? The silos. So I remember the old days, one person had the admin access, had root access, and they can do a whole bunch of stuff, bang out some key code, bang out some infrastructure, boom, it's up there. So now we're talking about a whole new age where it's not one person might even have the right access. You can understand the different components. But one, you have to understand the components. But two, it changes the actual organizational structure of the team now. We're talking the structure's different, the communication style different. Maybe how often you communicate is much faster, but all of a sudden you have to collaborate at a level today that you didn't have to like 5-10 years ago. I mean,
no, absolutely. Yeah. And we often refer to that, and it's a common term, but we refer to it as building a cloud center of excellence, right? Bringing the people, and a lot of times it is quite simply going to those existing silos, and maybe initially you take the best people or the people who've already started trying to educate themselves on the new technologies or who are moving in that direction. Those people may become kind of an oversight team or a tiger team, whatever you want to call it, but they become the core members of that center of excellence. They're going to help to define the different chains of communication, how the teams work together, right? You have to, before you can automate something, for example, you have to make certain that your approval processes and that everybody that is involved in that process from end to end understands what's going to happen and how it's going to happen. And a lot of times you talk about an individual IT process and it gets truncated, I guess is the best word, right? Someone says, oh, I want to automate my server builds. Well, they think of that as I throw a server in a rack, I stick I boot it up and I install the operating system. Well, that's not a server build because that server's now not ready to go into production. You've got to add the networking components. You've got to go in and add any agents for backups or security or virus scanning, anything along those lines. You've got to add it into your change control systems, your monitoring systems. All of those different things are part of that process. And so being able to map that process out step by step and then define the different authorization steps, authorization components, and how the different teams interact with each other during that process is crucial to being able to truly automate something like that. So yeah, to your point, those silos, they almost have to be broken down at least to some degree.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Can we start to think about why the need to collaborate more? And we're talking about automation. So this whole thing, a lot of time IT doesn't understand the market or business imperatives, right? So it's like the business is finding out they're losing market share inside of a very, very competitive landscape. And then at the board level, lines of business come together and they're seeing this new tech out there. And they say, oh, maybe we can use this new tech to improve a process or an experience, the way our customers interface with us. How do we move something across the assembly line faster? And once those business needs initiatives are done, then someone translates that and say, hey, we need this new initiative, and it has all these technical components. So in the old days, business analyst was a big thing, right? It's like, and it's huge, right? Let's start to map those requirements because we want to move faster to move the lines at our stores, and it requires X amount of new tech. And then somebody needs to translate, okay, what do we currently have today? So we start to do that need to speed. Okay, we need it fast. And all of a sudden it's like silos don't work anymore, right? It's impractical. It's, the business requires a speed, which requires you to know what's going on, sharing that knowledge, know what the dependencies are. So I think, sometimes some of the older IT professionals may have had a slight, maybe a transition in that thing. Now I got to work with a lot of different people. These young people come out of college, all of a sudden asking me to see what my diagram looks like. And they say, hey, you didn't upgrade your diagram. And why is it static and Visio, right? And they say, we need to update our architecture faster. We need you to put the code out faster, build faster. So it's interesting because a lot of these skills aren't necessarily technical, right? I got to work more with more people at a faster pace. So, have you seen, as you go around your clients, have you seen any struggles with teams saying, you know what, or CIO saying, you know what, I need my teams to be changed. I need them to transform. I need them to work fast. Yeah. Have you seen them have challenges from their internal teams on the ground laying, ooh, this is way too different for us?
It's funny. And you threw out a term there, business analyst, that is a crucial role today. But there's another role that has become equally, if not more important, and that's the financial analyst. You mentioned cloud costs a bit earlier, and being able to go in and build and manage and act upon the information coming out of something like a FinOps platform to really take those cloud costs and drive them down and kind of appropriate it back to what you're doing on-prem. That plays heavily into the agility that you're talking about, right? If I'm going to go in and deploy things quickly, and I'm going to go in and really react to changes within the business, I have to be able to do so, but I also have to do it without blowing up all of our budgets, right? And it's easy to go in and say, I'm going to roll out a bunch of new stuff, and then all of a sudden, boom, my budgets are blown, right? So those financial analysts and really understanding what the different components are going to cost and how they're billed. Is this a capital expenditure? Is this an operational expenditure that's charged by the month, by the day, by the hour? Those are all becoming extremely important. And quite frankly, they're not conversations that a lot of IT people are used to having. It's a fairly new paradigm to have IT teams that are discussing how things are billed and paid for and what sort of cost models they want to be running their organization under.
This is fascinating because you start to think about it now because so that back to that whole business, we're going to respond to market forces and we're going to invest X amount of dollars. And if somebody crunch some numbers and say, hey, if we do this, we can maybe increase our bottom line by a certain amount of percentage. But all of those models are relying on inputs. And a lot of those inputs come from technology, which comes from the IT department, right? The CIO, CTO saying, this is how much it costs to do that new thing you want to go do for the business. So it's fascinating where you went with that about financial analysts and crunch it down because they say, how much does it cost to run service X? Because if we get the wrong total cost of ownership, that's going to mess up the return on investment, right? So I think
100%.
I think we used to work with somebody who used to always say, there are no IT projects, there are only business projects.
Yes, sir, we did. We sure did.
Which is so,
Yep. And it was so true, and I mean, it's, I don't know where I was going with that.
Yeah, because sometimes we think like it's a project on the side. We're going to stand up something new, some new tech, but it's a business project. It got visibility, it has cost to it, and you need to make money return on it, which opens up a whole new world because you mentioned about blowing the budget, but maybe we deploy it in such a way where it's not as secure as it was before. So now we're enterprise risk management across the board, right? So now like, is this more exploitable than it was yesterday? And if not, we need to make it more secure. Do we blow our budget even more by making it more secure if we didn't think about it ahead of time? So just think about that whole security implications of not deploying it without the full spectrum of risk analysis in that process.
Oh, and I mean, think about how many new attack vectors there are, right? When you look at an application that's being developed and stored in a Git style repository, now you've got your source code that's being stored, it's being pulled out, it's being leveraged, changed, deployed, tested, etc. There's a ton of new attack vectors, and so you now have to, you now see things like source code scanning, you now see real-time injection scanning, you see real-time testing of applications, all of these different components that traditionally didn't really fall to IT that are now starting to fall to IT because, like you said, IT has gone beyond managing infrastructure and they're now managing service availability, right? I mean, if the application isn't up and the application's not accessible to the users in the business, it doesn't matter whether the server's up or the storage is up or the network is up. The application is the thing that matters. Nobody cares about the infrastructure. So,
which goes back to teaming. So to make sure that if you're deploying something new and it goes out and starts to use a different, maybe a different application language that your current security team doesn't have tools for, and somebody's going to go out there and buy new tools. It's like, oh, we didn't realize you guys didn't have tooling in-house. You said you scanned our code. Well, of these particular languages, but then the development team can use a different language that we don't support. Hey, can we have some money for that? So now all of a sudden, It's like, whoa, we got to hurry up and try to figure this out. So once again, it's like silos are really an enemy, almost like a legacy mindset. So no IT projects, all business projects. And of course, IT got to keep everything up and running all the time. Do you remember the old days where you'd have like a whole weekend for like maintenance windows?
Absolutely. I don't miss that.
I mean, but you can take everything down, right? Take everything down, patch firmware, upgrade code, all this time. And all of a sudden you shrink it because, this technology is underlying a business process, which works on a weekend.
Right. However, when you look at what's happened with the way that things are architected, now we can take it down whenever we want because you architect things in such a way that if I pull down components of this application, components of this infrastructure, I don't interrupt that service. That's huge, right? I mean, you talk about an IT guy's quality of life. That's nice when he says, instead of having to get up at 3 and 4 o'clock in the morning to take a few servers down and do some patches, you can just roll things across. And we did this for a customer a few years ago. They've got 2 different data centers. Each of them is in a different seasonal disaster zone.
Nice.
And so we help them build a biannual failover where, during the summer, they would run in one data center. And during that time, they would go through and do any maintenance or anything like that, upgrades that they needed to do in the other data center. Then at the end of the season, they would fail everything over. And this was 6 or 7 years ago, and recently they've moved into even more of an all-up kind of environment where they're doing real-time replication, they're doing distributed load hosting across their 2 data centers, and then they've got a third copy that they post out to one of the cloud providers, so that if they lose both of these data centers, they've got a third copy, right? So I mean, it's a similar paradigm, but it's a very, very different operational model. So
I like that because the old days was we think the redundancy or redundant infrastructure works, but we don't know until we have to fail over. So this one, you actually run it in that infrastructure. It works. Okay, switch it over to the other one. I just love that idea because I had many horror stories of trying to fail over a core switching or firewalling and it wouldn't switch back properly. It's like,
absolutely.
We wouldn't do it once a year. It's like, whoa.
Yeah. Yep. No, totally with you.
So, Chris, would you want to be like a CIO and just be responsible for 100% availability, totally secure at a great price for the business? Easy job, right?
Sounds super easy. Yeah. Barely an inconvenience, as my kids would say.
What do you say? The 3 dimensions?
No,
go ahead.
It's interesting because the CIO's role has changed dramatically, right? And traditionally CIOs have come from the application side of the business, and they have more of a development background, which makes sense if you think about the C-level interfacing with the CFOs and the CEOs. The CFOs and CEOs are not interested at all in the, as I would call it, the plumbing of IT, right? They want to make sure that the applications that the business needs are running. They want to make sure that the tooling and the workloads that people need in order to make the money for the business are available all the time, and that they get the performance they need. And so, a CIO now has to be much more interested in the infrastructure from a different perspective, though, right? They've got to look at all of those different things and take the financial accounting into play. They've got to take all of the different operating models of whether they're cloud or multi-cloud or hybrid cloud, et cetera. It's not anywhere near the easy job and the easy job it used to be, right? Like being a CIO was ever easy, but it's a much more complex world now. So,
well, I can say it's safe to say that next 10 years, IT professionals are going to have a lot of interesting work to do. never going to be a lack of technical fluency they need to have, but also these other skills, better communication skills, analytical skills, working in teams, seeing that systems view. So I'm really excited for everybody who's coming into the industry. And then for those who've been in the industry for decades, right? There's always something new, something interesting, a lot of career opportunities and growths and paths out there. So I'm pretty excited.
Oh, absolutely. Oh, it's going to be so fun. I mean, and if you think about it from your own developed smart IT platform, I look a lot at the maturity of an organization, right? And being able to walk into an organization and say, hey, look, here's where you're telling me that you want to be in 2 years. Here's where you are today. Here are the steps that you're going to have to go through to get there, right? And that's one of the things that's so interesting as we move forward and as we look down the road at the breadth of AI technologies and edge technologies that are coming into play, becoming mainstream, right? I mean, who would have thought 2 years ago that ChatGPT would be as big of a deal as it is, right? I mean, it's literally everywhere. You have edge technologies where you're using small IoT sensors and hundreds of them on an individual piece of machinery so that you can tell whether a piece of machinery halfway across the world is going to need maintenance in 6 months or not. That type of thing, and those incremental levels of maturity and gaining more IT smarts is going to keep a lot of people busy and keep a lot of people learning new things over the coming years.
So I think you're saying if the business want to improve, businesses want to stay competitive, stay relevant, they're going to need the IT teams to perform at a high level. And it sounds like a great opportunity for us to work better as a team, always continues to learn, educate ourselves, share information, and just help one another. So I think,
absolutely.
I think this is a great spot to close out, Chris. We could probably go on for hours here. A lot of cool things and topics around here, but I think it's a good place to stop for today. I really appreciate your time today.
Okay. No, absolutely, man. I appreciate you having me on. This was fun.
Hey, if anybody wanted to reach out and just hang out with you for a beer or talk shop, how can people find you?
You know what? You can find me. You can email me at chris@rchrisnorris.com, or you can see me on Twitter at rchrisnorris.
Awesome, man. Appreciate it. So we wrap.
Absolutely.
So now we'll wrap another episode of the Smart IT Podcast, and we look forward to seeing you on the next episode. Thank you very much. Thanks for joining another episode of the Smart IT Podcast, where we explore what's next for IT and disrupt the status quo, simplify the complex, and reduce risk together. If you like what you hear, please like, subscribe, and leave your comments. And for more Smart IT wisdom, check out my website at williamreed.info.